Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. My name is Jason Thompson, and I have a master's in TESOL and a master's in language testing. And I am a member of the assessment unit at the higher colleges of technology here in the UAE. So I'm going to talk about using the CEFR descriptors to create bands for grading writing assessments, and I'm hoping that my presentation is going to be around 10 minutes. So in order to discuss this, I'm going to first of all give a very brief overview of the CEFR, and then I'm going to talk about the steps to create the writing bands, and then I'm going to finish with things to avoid or be aware of when you are using the descriptors to create bands. So we often hear a lot mentioned about the CEFR, whether we're talking about the levels of students or materials or assessments. We often hear these levels being mentioned. We heard it a couple of times in the conference with some of the sessions that I have attended, but I often wonder sort of how much do people know about the CEFR. So for the first bit, I'm just going to very briefly give some information and some details, background to it. So the CEFR stands for the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, Learning, Teaching and Assessment, giving it its full title. And as you can see from the purpose there at the bottom of the slide, it is designed to connect the syllabus, curriculum, teaching and learning, and assessment. So if we have a look at the history of it, the starting point was in 1991 at a symposium in Switzerland. I think this is where the seeds were sown for the CEFR. But it wasn't until 10 years later that the actual CEFR was published. Since then, it's been updated a couple of times. The first time in 2018 with the publication of the CEFR companion volume with new descriptors. And as it says, this is where new descriptors were added to the companion volume, to the CEFR. And then most recently in 2020, which they are calling, which was the publication of the definitive version of the companion volume. And in this one, there was a complete set of extended CEFR descriptors, which replaced the original set, which was published in 2001. And this one includes new descriptors and scales. Now, if I was in a face-to-face presentation now, I would be asking you if you knew how many CEFR levels there were and how many scales there are in the CEFR companion volume, and even if you knew how many descriptors there were. Obviously, if you're very, very quick, you can type those answers in the chat box. Be very quick because I'm going to be moving on to the next slide now and giving you those answers. So in the latest companion volume, there are 93 scales, and these range from addressing audiences, reading instructions, writing notes, to things like grammatical accuracy, vocabulary range, and other scales. And these scales, they make up 1,832 descriptors in total from those 93 scales. There are 6 levels. So you have the A level, A1 and A2, which is the basic user, the B level, B1, B2, which is the independent user, and the C level, C1, C2, which is the proficient user. There are also plus levels, and you will find these in some of the scales in the companion volume, but the plus levels are only at A2, B1, and B2. So they have the A2 plus, B1 plus, and B2 plus. And I'll just show you an example of this. So this is the scale of overall oral comprehension. And you can see with those dark red arrows, it shows in the top row of A2, B1, and B2, this shows where those plus levels are. And in fact, if you look below, in 2018, when they published the companion volume, they actually added another level there, so a 7th level, as it were, as in pre-A1. So that was a very brief overview. You can get the companion volume and other resources from the CFR website. I recommend it. It's lots of interesting information. The CFR has been published in around 40 languages, and this includes Arabic. So I would check out the website for more resources. So I'm now going to talk about the steps to create the writing bands. Before I go into these steps, I just want to say that as I'm explaining the steps, I'm going to be showing examples of the writing bands that we created last year. And I'm going to be showing you an analytic rating scale, as this is the ones that we created for our writing bands. And it's easier to explain for the purposes of this session as well. And I also want to mention that these steps need to be done in a group. And for us, this was the 5 members of the assessment unit. Okay, so the first step is that you need to select the CFR scales, and you need to use ones that are appropriate for your context and your needs and the aspects of language that you want to assess and you want to focus on. And you can see there is a quote there from the CFR companion volume that actually shows that this is something that they recommend people do as well. So for our context, we selected these scales, these 5 scales from the companion volume. The next step, we need to add the descriptors to a table. And we need to add them according to the number of scales and the aspects, well, the number of scales, the aspects of writing that you have chosen, and the type of writing as well that you have chosen. And you also need to take into account the CFR levels needed for the range of students that you will be testing. So, for example, for us, we, as I said, had those 5 scales, and our writing bands go from band 1, which is the pre-A1, and up to band 10, which is C1. The range of our students mostly falls between A2 and B1 plus. On those rare occasions, we may have a pre-A1, and those very, very rare occasions, we might actually have a C1. But most of our students, when they're taking tests, fall into A2 to B1 plus. So the next step is to fill in the gaps. And again, as it says here in this quote from the companion, so not all of the scales have descriptors at every single level. And this is especially the case for the plus levels. So some scales may not have an A2 plus descriptor or a B1 plus descriptor, and other scales may not have any descriptors at the very low bands, at pre-A1 or at the very top, at C2. So you need to fill in these gaps. And when you're filling in these gaps, as I said, it's important to be focusing on the plus levels, and these are even more important if these are the passing grades. So if your passing grade is a B1 plus, rather than having a vague descriptor like the performance shares features of B1 and B2, it is a much better idea to include your own descriptors for this, not only for the raters, but also for teachers and students who need it for teaching and learning purposes.
Mr. Jason, you have 5 more minutes.
Okay, thank you, Sophia. And also you need to fill in the gaps for the range of students. And at this time also, you need to be thinking of adding other descriptors for aspects of writing or the type of writing tasks that you will be doing. Okay, so for us, we had these gaps to fill in, and this is what we filled in. And as you can see, for some of the levels like B1 plus, it was important for us to add extra descriptors to that level. Once you've done that, it's very important to adapt the descriptors. And again, this is something that the CEFR recommends. And the reason for this is the CEFR by its nature is very general. So you need to adapt the descriptors and make sure that they fit your needs, the context, and the type of writing that you will be doing with your students. But when you're adapting or adding descriptors, you've got to make sure that the level is appropriate. You shouldn't be adding abilities that should be at a higher or lower level. Here is if you can look at the things highlighted in yellow, you can see where we were had to adapt those descriptors for our purposes. Okay. Then the next step is very important to pilot the bands. Think of this as your road test and make sure that you use them to grade the type of essays that they would be used for, and make sure you have a range of levels so that you're using all or as many of the bands as possible, and they should be graded individually. And the next step, you should be finalizing the bands, and this should be done back in your group. You can edit and change and add, delete where necessary. And if needs be, you can add a note or a glossary for that purpose to help teachers and raters understand the bands. Going on to understanding, it's very important, as with all assessments where rating is involved, you need to train. So you need to be presenting these bands to teachers or raters, and you also need to be having a standardization, so where you can be using sample essays for practice, and then an actual standardization where raters or teachers will be using the bands for themselves. And it's important at each of these stages that you are available to answer any questions. So we had our standardization on our LMS, and this is just some examples, but I'm going to have to go through this fairly quickly. And we also gave reports for those essays that were being banded to explain what bands they were given and why. Okay, so very quickly, things that you need to be aware of, things you need to avoid when you are using the CEFR descriptors. You need to make sure that you don't use the descriptors for a purpose that they were not designed for. So you can't be taking descriptors from one scale, then putting them into another scale. As mentioned, you need to use the descriptors. You've got to adapt them, okay? You can't use descriptors without adapting them to fit your needs or your context. When you have created your new bands, make sure you use them for the purpose that they were created for. So if you are suddenly using them from a different task or a different type of writing, then you need to adapt them for those types of writing or the context or any new target language situations. It's also very important that you don't move any competencies to higher or lower levels. Okay, so you shouldn't expect test takers or students to show an ability which is not expected for that level. So for example, paragraphing comes in at B1, so you can't suddenly move paragraphing to A2. Okay, and again, this is something that is recommended for from the companion volume. Okay, so that is the end of my presentation, and if you have any questions, I shall look forward to answering them at the end. Thank you very much.